Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes for all of our participants to join and get their audio going, get settled, and then we'll kick it off. All right. So, hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Toni Phelan. I'm a program manager for MBA programs at Forté, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Forté's Women Lead webinar series. Today, we are partnering with ESADE Business School. Our webinar is titled Managing Your Impact in Corporate Presentations, and this webinar will be recorded and available on our website following this presentation. So before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about Forté for those who may be new to the Women Lead series. Forté has been around for 20 years. Our community of over 100,000 motivated and inspiring women is changing the balance of power in the workplace. We open doors for women to reimagine what they can achieve in business, from launching their first jobs all the way up to advancing to the C-suite. Through business education, role models, professional networks, and leadership trainings like this one, Forté shows women how to build the credibility, skills, network, and confidence to thrive as leaders and change the status quo. So we're delighted to host today's event in partnership with ESADE, and I will now turn the session over to Jeroen Verhoeven, Associate Director of Recruitment and Admissions, MBA and Masters, ESADE Business Law School. He'll share more about their programs before introducing our featured speaker. Jeroen, take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation. A pleasure to be on board for today's event. Greetings from Barcelona, Spain, where it is currently 6 p.m. in the evening. Delighted to listen to the presentation today in a few moments. I work in our admissions team, and I just wanted to very quickly, in 1 or 2 minutes, share a few things about our MBA programs. Very dynamic programs. We have a mix of both full-time and executive MBA programs that can be done in different formats. For example, the full-time MBA can be done in 12, 15, or 18 months. The executive MBA can be done modular, hybrid in Barcelona or in Madrid. So basically, it's one MBA, but done in different formats. And in, I would say, 2 very exciting cities in the world, and also, of course, with international options available. As you can see here, locations in Barcelona and Madrid. ESADE, we've been around for quite a while, more than 60 years. We are a top-ranked school in all major rankings, be it Financial Times, QS, Poets and Quants, etc. I would like to stress and highlight the international nature of our education. Although based in Spain, everything we do is in English. And some of our programs, such as the full-time MBA, we have actually more than 95% of students coming from outside of Spain. So Spain is, let's say, our entourage, the world as our playing field, so to speak. With that in mind, our global alumni network is very powerful because in addition to the MBA, we also offer Masters of Science, we offer undergrad, so it's a globally spread out network available worldwide. And obviously, we have also a very powerful career services, and people stay in touch with the business school for the rest of their lives. I know some of you who are listening today are already enrolled in an MBA, others might be considering an MBA. And for those who would like more information, please have a look on the screen. You see my contact details, a little bit of a double Dutch tongue twister, maybe my name, Jeroen Verhoeven. You see my email there. Please feel free also to reach out on LinkedIn. And at ESADE, we are organized geographically in terms of admissions. My responsibilities include the United States and the Benelux countries in Europe, but it will be my pleasure to put you in touch with any of my colleagues responsible for your zone if you'd like to know more about our programs. But let's quickly move on to what brought us together today. And that is, of course, a very exciting webinar from one of our professors, as well as our academic director of Hybrid Global Excellence. I love that title. And it really taps into the beautiful dynamic versions of our global learning facilities that we have. So it's a pleasure to introduce Katharine D'Amico. Katharine, thank you so much for sharing some of your valuable insights. And the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Jeroen and to the Forté Association for giving me the opportunity to give a little bit of insight on where women and leadership, and in my case, where neuroscience clashes. So if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to share my screen. And Today, what I would like to do within the context of Forté and empowering you students, current students, or future students, is to look at the idea of leadership, to look at the idea of success with a little bit of a different optic. So, as my colleague Jerome mentioned, my name is Katharine D'Amico. I'm originally from Canada, but I'm based here in Barcelona, Spain. And I am, as well as being the academic director of one of our formats of the executive MBA program, I am also professor of applied neuroscience. And one of the areas that I am especially passionate about and dedicate as much time as I can is to what you see here on the screen, the gender dynamics in language, how language and communication affects perception, and how many, many times a lot of the barriers and walls and challenges that women face at no matter what point in their career has to do with language and perception management. So this is a little known perspective that I'm taking. I'm not taking it from the organizational behavior. I'm not going to be talking about leadership styles, and I'm not a psychologist. However, I am a linguist, and my PhD is in brain science and neuroscience. And to this end, I would like to share with you, and as you can see here, the 3 different areas from my experience that you see here on best case success techniques and the most perhaps boiled down techniques and insights that I can give you from where communication and neuroscience and gender come all together. So first and foremost, from my academic activity at ESADE. Also outside of ESADE, you can see a lot of big names of corporations and industries here, which understand that if you think of any leader or anyone who inspires you, formal positions of authority is dedicated, and indicated by the position one holds. But real authority and real leadership happens in the form of talk. So with all of the industries and companies you see here, I regularly train women and men, C-suite and others, to understand how the brain works and how communication works for internal stakeholders and for external reputation and success. Some of you also may be familiar with TED Talks. I regularly host here at ESADE a TEDx. We actually are doing it with our full-time MBA students. We're hosting a TEDx this coming May, this spring. And also we're looking to host a TEDx Women. So a lot of these techniques have to do with influence and impact, which very, very clearly translates over into a critical competency, which is your success and your professional and personal reputation. So let me begin by one of the most important insights, in my opinion. You can have all the training in the world. You can have all the expertise in the world. But the difference between the success and failure of any initiative, of any innovation, of any change, of any shift happens in the minds of people. And it happens in the how something was communicated. Rarely does inspiring action happen from the content of something. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the content is not important. Rational analytical messages will determine ultimately your credibility, of course. But what neuroscience has a lot to say is in how our brains are structured and how, therefore, we can learn how to frame messages and bang that balance of analytical and emotional appeal, which ultimately determine a lot of our perception of others that have of us. So I'd like to quickly tell you, some of you may know about neuroscience. Some of you, if you are enrolled in programs, may have even taken classes on neuroscience, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about that soft mass you have between your ears. The brain, 1.3 kilos. In other words, it weighs the same as a MacBook Air. And your brain, and here's something to wrap your mind around, is the most complex structure of any known structure in the universe. And it is fascinating how little we understand, and it is very powerful to understand how we receive and generate perception, how communication contributes to that, and how you can, of course, use this in your professional careers when we speak about women and leadership and finding their voice and finding their place. So your brain is made up of fat, blood vessels, a lot of soft tissue, a lot of water and neuroplasticity, the fluid around your brain, which protects it. And all of this works in perfect synchronicity with the more than 100 muscles that we have in our face, in your upper and lower jaw, in your throat, and in your lips to produce a puff of air, which is called your language. Everyone is powerful. The problem is, and if we speak about communication, that success, all success, is a question of belief. And that belief, that word believe, actually links very powerfully to parts of the brain which we don't give or spend a lot of time on or pay attention to. Now, I've been speaking for approximately 11 minutes now, maybe, give or take. And in your minds, even though we're all connected remotely, in your minds, I know a snap decision has been made. And I know that that snap decision was whether you believed me to be confident and competent and whether you have decided to trust me. I don't want to know what that decision is, but I do know that that decision has happened, as it does in all people, at the base of your skull, where your spinal column meets the back of your skull and the very base of your brain. And this is how perceptions are formed. Perceptions are formed not so much with the content of what I'm saying, but a great deal in how I am saying it and how you communicate. In other words, body language, form of voice, eye contact, hand movements, tone, energy, all of these things feed into this very, very ancient part of your brain and form a perception. To change perceptions is actually quite a difficult thing, as we know from cognitive science, and this is something called the representation bias. So understanding how perceptions are formed, how they are maintained, and how they can be managed is kind of the key of what I would like to talk about today. In order to do that, we need to talk about language. And the definition that I give to language from a neuroscience perspective is that language is learned social behavior. It's learned, it's social, and it's in the end a behavior, verbal behavior and nonverbal behavior. So it's learned because you are not born speaking. You are born with a potential to speak. You take a child and you isolate that child from all social environment, that child will have a very hard time speaking and connecting socially. And as studies show, beyond a certain point, that child will never learn language. So you cannot, or it is very, very difficult to separate social and language. Your language manages your social relationships, professional and personal. It's very hard to separate. So understanding how language, verbal and nonverbal, contribute to perception is the key and best practice of where neuroscience and communication trains true leaders, how you become sincerely unforgettable and how you become unstoppable. And to this, I owe a great deal to Dr. Deborah Tannen, who influenced me in my PhD. My PhD is on neuroscience, brain science, influence, and language. And back in the 1970s, Dr. Tannen was a pioneer in showing that how we are socialized as children has real life implications when we hit the board and when we hit MBA programs and when you are starting your professional careers or advancing in professional careers. In other words, language is learned social behavior, and the social element has a very, very interesting genetic and gender sort of element to it, if I may. And this, Dr. Deborah Tannen, in her research, defines these differences in how boys and girls use language when they're young She defines this as linguistic styles. Now, although there are many, I've chosen a few today to show you exactly what we mean. And the definitions of a linguistic style are the actual punctuations and different elements that someone uses, such as pausing, commenting, questioning, interrupting, questions, apologies, compliments, whether you tend towards a direct style or an indirect style. A lot of this is learned, yes, as you proceed and as you advance with experience, but a lot of this is embedded in us when we are very young, because language is learned social behavior, and your first input comes from your social caregiving group, family, parents, and caregivers when you are learning language and when your brain is forming and when you have decided what your values and beliefs are. What is rude? Should you interrupt? What about apologies? How should you ask a question? All of this very much is determined, as shown by Dr. Tannen's research, at a very, very young age. Now, here's where it gets interesting. She shows in her research that women use language in a very special way. She calls it rapport talk. Girls, young women, and women in their professional lives use language in a way which preserves group dynamics, avoids conflict, and avoids affirmations which puts anybody at a disadvantage or singles them out in a way. I'll get more to this about what I mean. And men, on the other hand, or young boys, the way that they use language show that they are much more socially conditioned, perhaps, to be more sensitive to the power dynamics, and that verbally their language position themselves top down, and that their language also shows that they are very reluctant and resistant to assume positions which are inferior to others. And this stems back to power dynamics. So how does this all work? Your language generates a perception. It doesn't matter how you feel, it's other people who will receive a perception from your language, verbal language and nonverbal language. And this is where it gets very, very interesting, because success is something that other people give you. So to understand what perceptions you are generating is the absolute key to success in scaling and managing and influencing the widest amount of people possible. And that really is the task and challenge that any leader has. So I'd like now to go to perceptions, and a study that I participated in and is published in Harvard Business Review about the different words that we use to describe male leaders and to describe female leaders. Now, there are a lot of studies on this, but this one is particularly interesting. There were 8,200 participants, and these participants were given a list of 90 positive attributes and 90 negative attributes. So a list of 90 and 90. And men and women were asked, describe for me a successful male leader, or describe for me a male leader who would be toxic and very difficult to work for, out of these attributes. And the same for a woman. This whole pool of people were asked to choose from the list in describing a woman who was a successful, inspiring leader, and likewise a woman who just wasn't trustworthy or was not a good leader, out of these lists of attributes. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. So again, a list of 90 attributes positive and the 90 attributes negative that men and women had to choose from. And this is how perceptions work. So we use different language to describe the men and women. And all of these, you can read of this in the different words we use to describe male and female leaders. There's been various studies done on this. The attributes that both men and women use really do affirm the perceptions that we have. And again, perceptions stem very, very far back into our social language and how socially we attribute language, and therefore perceptions come from that. And again, this is very deep rooted in the part of the brain which is responsible for perceptions in the first place. So out of those 90 attributes, when asked to describe a male leader who was a successful male leader and one who's inspirational, these were the top 4, statistically speaking. He is analytical, he's competent, for some reason athletic, I don't know why this was chosen, and trustworthy. So this, men and women both believe that if a male leader is successful, this is the attributes and perception that he's likely to portray. Now, what about a negative male leader? These are the top 2 and only 2 by statistical choice that all of men and women out of 90 options used to describe a male leader who was unsuccessful or difficult or a failure. And he is described as being arrogant and irresponsible. Now, you may say, all right, yes, that would be really difficult to work with someone who is arrogant and irresponsible. However, it is very interesting to note that if someone is arrogant and irresponsible in his duty as a leader, it questions his style of leadership, but it doesn't question his competency, his ability to get the job done. This is clearly a different question here of perception. So now let's look at women. Out of 90, she is voted successfully, if she's a leader and successful, as being compassionate, as being enthusiastic, energetic, and the number 1 was organized. Now, this paints a very different picture of our expectations of where a woman needs to exceed at, or perhaps where her language and perception shows that she has these more communal traits that she's expected to demonstrate, all of these. And if I go back to the rapport talk from Deborah Tannen's research, we see very clearly to preserve the group dynamics and avoid conflict is very much the compassionate and enthusiastic area that we see. Now let's see of the negative attributes given to her. They far outweigh the male. She is, by men and women vote, inept, frivolous, talkative, nervous, temperamental, emotional, and indecisive. Now, if I look at the first attribute on this screen and the very last one, that's inept and indecisive, that clearly questions the ability to lead. You do not want an indecisive leader, not possible. Nor would you ever describe a successful leader, difficult to work with or collaborate with if you like, as inept. Inept clearly questions the actual competence of the person. Now, while there's a lot of debate on this, again, the perspective I am taking about this is perceptions. Why? Why do men and women feel that women are emotional? When we know in the brain as a fact, men and women are equally emotional. The area of the brain, the limbic system, dedicated to emotion is equal. What may differ is the expression of emotion, the acceptance of that. However, both men and women agree that women are more emotional. But I hear time and time again when I work on this that women say it's not emotion, it's passion or it's dedication. So why are these perceptions happening? So when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that the complement to this study showed that men by far say that or feel or have the perception that women are defensive when they're challenged. Again, this idea of that we are women more emotional, that we need stronger opinions. This is a very, very important point. Why are, in these cases, opinions given or expressed by women perceived as being weak or not confident? That's the important point where language comes in. And the afraid of how women react when they are criticized or when they are given feedback. And of course, if you look at McKinsey reports, very interesting on women feedback, women ask for feedback as much as men do, but they are less likely to get feedback, which helps them proceed and progress in their careers. What does she say? It's difficult to be heard in a meeting, especially when we have some industries, probably most industries, aside from health and education. Aside from health and education, we see that most women, when they progress career-wise, are at the minority or in the minority. And many times I've been sitting on panels and collaborating with events where women are the only woman at the table. So how can you be heard? And heard, I draw your attention to. This is a very interesting communication point. And again, this area of emotion, it's not emotion, it's passion, my intention versus the perception. We're outnumbered, and of course, we don't receive the quality feedback that we're looking for and that we ask for. So all of this leads to who gets the job in the end. It's not a question of expertise, years of experience, age, or know-how. It's a question in a great part to do with, if there are equal candidates, man and a woman, perception will overrule, and perception really does matter. Perception matters as much as the facts do. So I would like to begin with the language and the view of neuroscience and language, and how language and neuroscience can help us learn more about perception. Now, my insights here are based on my own PhD and that, of course, of the research by Dr. Tannen. It is by no means, disclaimer, saying that all women are the same. Absolutely not. So it is interesting to know that when women differ from this in their style, upbringing, and beliefs, that's fantastic. And it also actually serves, but the perception comes from language. So the first insight I would like to draw your attention to is of a simple pronoun. We know through the socialization of girls that when girls play together, we tend to, in this effort to preserve group dynamics, we choose more the pronoun of we. Men, on the other hand, coming from boys perhaps, who are more encouraged to talk about their accomplishments, tend to use more the pronoun of I. So let's suppose we have what I like to call a high-octane meeting, where you have two individuals of equal expertise, of equal experience, know-how, and power at the table. They have both led successful projects, and they are both invited to speak. The woman's language will refer and defer more to her team in the use of we. Well, what did we manage to pull together and succeed? What did we manage to do, me and my team? However, we see that when we analyze the language used, that the man at that table will use the more what I have managed to do without this reference to his team. Now, if I were to ask you, who sounds more confident? The pronoun I gets more notice by men and women, which is interesting, and it's just a pronoun. Now, the issue around this stems back to, again, how we are socialized, and deep down, how that affects our habits, our values, our beliefs in our brain. And most women I work with through the Alumni Association here at ESADE, which is 70,000 strong, and associations, for example, like Women in Microsoft, there is a big issue. A lot of women, not all women, but a lot of women feel very uncomfortable saying, well, I did this, because they fear it is being too aggressive or masculine or pushy or self-promoting. It's only a pronoun. And yet it is a very, very powerful insight into the perception that others have of you. Another issue comes around the idea of questions. How we ask questions is another element of difference that we see of the gender dynamics of language. So we would say that the hallmark of any good manager or leader is asking good questions. How we ask the questions and the frequency of it can lead to, as stated here, unintended signals regarding perception. So we see that women, as we aim for understanding in a lot of C-suite situations, women ask questions. We have no problem asking questions. So we will ask and ask without any fear or repercussion. We will ask. And the way we ask questions is very transparent, usually, as shown by language studies. I don't understand how you got to A, B, and C. Could you go through that again? But what about? Ask and ask. Now, the idea of questions is handled very differently when we look at the language used in C-suite situations. Men tend to ask a lot of fewer questions, and the way that a question will be asked is very different. So the way that a man would ask that question would be, look, you explained A, B, and C, but the way you explained the transfer of B to C is not clear. Could you explain that again, please? Because it is shown, and again, I go back to Deborah Tannen's fascinating research, that a lot of men are more sensitive to the power status signal that a question may send to others. In other words, if you ask too many questions, the signal is you don't know. So a lot of men will refrain from that rather than ask and risking that unintended signal about competency, confidence at the matter of hand, and therefore the power status in the room. And although this is perhaps an exaggeration, I know that I have this with my male friends, some of my male colleagues, definitely my husband, that they are reluctant to even ask for directions. This asking of questions is a very fascinating linguistic style of how we ask questions and the signals and perception that that generates. Another element of linguistic style is apologies. Now, it is a very interesting study about apologies. It is shown that women use apologies, but not in a literal sense. So, for example, if Tony and I were speaking about the Forté Association, and perhaps she was talking about a particular challenge she has professionally, she may say, or I may say, oh, wow, I'm really sorry. Now, that doesn't mean that it's my fault, or that doesn't mean that I contributed to this challenge that a colleague is dealing with. When women use apologies, we actually mean it that it's an expression of empathy. I hear you, tell me more. So we use it as a means of expressing concern. Now, if you take women who ask a lot of questions, use the pronoun we, and start apologizing in this boardroom, we begin to see a very different perception happening to everybody there. Men don't apologize, not as much as women do. And definitely, in my case, I'm Canadian, definitely not as a Canadian woman does. Men just simply don't apologize. However, the women use this more as a ritual means of empathy and of connecting and of showing I am actively listening to you, and it really matters to me what you're going to say next. So the way we use language is different. It's not so literal. So a woman would use an apology, not for it's my fault. However, I'm sorry what happened. Tell me more. Now, if a male counterpart or a colleague is not using this in the same way, here's where misunderstanding happens. So studies also show that women apologize more often, actually up to a 42% more often, because of thresholds of what we consider to be offensive. That there are various studies on that. However, apologizing excessively, even with the intent of empathy, could be seen as weakness by those who don't share the same linguistic style. So in hearing someone apologize more than once for something could send this unintended signal that, maybe they did make a lot of errors and they're asking too many questions. All in all, this could be contributing to a sensation that that person may not be as competent as previously thought. One interesting linguistic style that men tend to share more than women do is something called verbal opposition. Verbal opposition is the outward verbal challenge of an idea. In other words, it is shown again from Deborah Tannen's research that when boys and men put an idea on the table, they are expecting the challenge, the resistance, the criticism, and the denial to stress test the idea. They look forward to it. And in many cases, and some of you may have the experience, the voices rise, levels of volume go up in the room, and this is a sensation that anyone who is uncomfortable with interrupting or raising their voice risks sending the message, you can't defend your ideas. When in actual fact, it has to do with ideas that volume may be rude, or there may be cultural reasons or reasons that you're uncomfortable interrupting. And even how do you interrupt is a whole wealth of beliefs and values around that. So when you have this verbal opposition, this is a hurdle that a lot of women face when they progress professionally, and when, as often is the case, they are the minority in the room. Because women don't usually speak or hash out ideas in this way. But a room full of male colleagues or men usually do. So again, if you are the sort of person that finds it uncomfortable to raise your voice or to interrupt and cut people off, the perception could be that your ideas are not worth defending, or your contributions are getting overlooked. And therefore, perhaps the idea of competence and confidence now is suffering as a result, when it only is, at the end of the day, a language issue. Now, the last one I would like to talk about is direct versus indirect. And this, again, is very much determined by the gender dynamics of style and language, and how women fall into a style that is usually not shared by male counterparts. So we find in studies that women are usually more indirect, especially when we are in managerial leadership positions and we're asking others to do something, or we need them to carry something through. We are actually way more indirect when it comes to that. And men, on the other hand, are especially indirect when it comes to admitting fault or blame or issues. But when we see a man telling his team or a male telling his team that he needs to do something, we find that the men have no problem adopting a more direct style. So here's an example. I was working with women in Microsoft precisely, and there was an issue where a woman was co-working with a male colleague, and they were sharing a space together. And he was eating at his desk, and she wanted to tell him in a very direct, professional way, please don't eat at the desk because it bothers me. And this is the way that she did it. Wouldn't you be more comfortable having lunch in the staff room? Or isn't it true that most people eat their lunches in the kitchen? Now, this is very indirect. My bet is that a lot of you may agree with me. If it was a woman at the other end of that question, she would get it, that she was uncomfortable for some reason, and that, yes, you would take your lunch or your coffee elsewhere. However, the answer that this particular woman received was, no, I'm fine exactly where I am. So, understanding that direct and indirect really do lead to misunderstandings and mistrust and a lot of frustration if you don't share the same unintended meaning. In other words, we mean more than we say. So it's not just a simple question of, well, I already asked him and I was very direct. Maybe in your mind you were, but the perception at the other end and how that is received is the key to understanding how influence and leadership work. Now, this may be a very simple thing to say. However, it is truly, when we speak about women leadership, men and women getting through influence, decision-making, anticipating resistance, denial on all fronts, innovating, challenges, and uncertainty. The end of the day, it is a question of confidence. Now, confidence is as important as competence is. Confidence in your language. And for this, I would say, part of that snap decision that is made when we first meet someone, before even they begin speaking, that part of the brain, which is right at the base of your skull, or at the top of your spinal column, we find here the 3 internal triggers behind all of human behavior, all of our decisions, all of our language even. And that is our values, our habits, and our beliefs. Everything is anchored to our habits, values, and beliefs. And habits is a very, very interesting point in itself. We do not like to change our habits. It's uncomfortable. It wastes energy, and our brains are very brain energy saving organs. We don't like to take the risk because our brains function in the sense that we crave certainty. Whatever's worked for us in the past, we like to stay that way because it's more comfortable. It's less painful. There's less risk of loss. However, habits, when we have to change them, can actually feel very strange. It's just different. We all have habits with our language because they are socially grounded when we're very young. So these values and beliefs come out in our language. And a lot of women say to me, well, but that's so aggressive. That's so male. That's a belief. All it is language. All it is at the end is a pronoun and grammar. And what it does for you, if you look at your language, is it will manage the perception. And yes, it's a change in habit, and changing habits is a very hard thing to do. From a neuroscience perspective, is actually why innovation all around is so hard. Because we make our decisions based on habits, our values, and our beliefs. And none of that is rational. We like to think of ourselves as very objective, unbiased, rational, professional beings. But that unbiased, objective, rational being has not been born on planet Earth. Your emotional limbic system of your brain is 5 million years older than your rational prefrontal cortex. You cannot expect to lead and manage and inspire action by divorcing or not contemplating how all of this works together and very subconsciously in everything that we do and in everything that we say. So I like to talk about language when I speak about confidence, because this is a very easy thing to say, but a hard thing to manage and master and even feel. There's an elusive part of confidence. And I would say, if we're speaking about language, and I would say if we're speaking about confidence, the most important voice you will ever hear is the voice inside your head. So listen to it and start filtering, because we really are who we think we are, who we tell ourselves we are. That really is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it really begins very deep in the brain, to areas of how we mutually evaluate ourselves. And how we mutually evaluate ourselves happens in the form of talk, happens in the form of language, verbal and nonverbal. And to refer to Dr. Tannen again, there is no one way to speak, to have that meeting, to manage this type of diversity is a huge insight for industry, because we know that the more diverse are our teams, the more financially profitable they are, the more creative they are, and the more productive we are. So this has a lot to do with managing the diversity and a lot of the challenges that you will face. So the way you do shape your future and the way you lead and motivate other people entirely depends 100,000% on how well you communicate and on how you motivate other people to follow you. And then I have to say, I'm completely against the idea that it is a soft skill. We could call communication a non-technical skill, if you will, but it is probably the hardest, most competitive skill you could ever nail if you're thinking about progressing in any industry. So I thank you very much. It was an effort for me to condense a lot of fascinating research on brains and language in such a short time. But I will stop sharing. I would welcome any sort of deep dive or clarification or question into any of the parts of what brain science and communication has to do. I'm also happy to send bibliography and give best case examples, but it is an absolutely fascinating area. And if I look behind Tony and I say, more women leading, was communication is a huge, huge competitive part of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor D'Amico. Such interesting research, and we do have some audience questions. So we can dive into some of those. So let's see. The first one, we're getting a couple of questions on this is the way that we learn to communicate is so ingrained in us from such a young age, as you spoke about. Can we retrain ourselves, and how do we go about doing that? And I know you said it is possible to practice that, but do you have any strategies or things that you've done or things that you recommend people do to work on that?
The short answer to that is a resounding yes. The longer answer to that is it's a habit change, and takes patience and it takes time. If communication was easy, can you imagine that? If communication was easy, wow, we wouldn't have the international conflicts that we have. We wouldn't even have needs for negotiations. I mean, that is just, it's mind-blowing. All right, how do we do this? A very important part of understanding the answer to that question is the part of change. So I just said, all right, can you re-change? Can you retrain? That implies that you've done one thing and you want to change and do something different. Now that's change. Change is tough. We don't like change. Change is painful, it's uncertain, it makes us nervous, it makes us unsure. Now, here's an interesting insight about the brain. When we think about the future, we actually depend on our experiences in the past. What does that mean? That means if I'm going to make a decision in the future, I'm going to change my style, I'm going to work on this, I need to be perceived as more confident, I'm getting feedback that I'm not. Okay, that's great. I have to speak in public at a board meeting. This is an opportunity for me to change. What happens in the brain is the brain will say, oh, you have to speak at a board meeting. Hang on, let's go back in time. Did we ever before speak in a board meeting? Yes. How did that feel? Awful. I was stressed, I was anxious, I hated it. Oh, well, that's what it's going to be like. So what does the brain do? It's actually not a question of technique or hardcore reading or anything. It's actually a question of the emotional correlation. Because here's one of the founding principles of neuroscience. Emotions make memories. Any event, even any person, you attach an emotion to it. And the success of that event in the future depends on the emotional correlation anchored to it. So the first work in retraining, and the answer to that question is, number one, what emotion is attached to it? And second, you've got to train yourself to feel, not think, feel differently about it. And that takes time. I don't know if I answered the question. So
I think you did. I think there were a lot of great tips in there. So thank you. Thank you for expanding on that a little bit more. So kind of building off of that question, speaking of learning things when we're young, for those of us out here that are caregivers who maybe have young children in the home, young girls in the home, or taking care of other loved ones who are young, what can we do? How can we model this for them and start to help them be better communicators?
Yeah, I love that question. I have 3 daughters and I have a hard time doing this. Why? Because habits, values, and belief run deep in the brain. They're subconscious and they're quick. Therefore, in my upbringing, as with many women and girls, we are brought up to think that speaking directly is rude. Now, speaking directly is simply a grammatical question, and you're not necessarily rude or aggressive or self-promoting. So what I do with my daughters is I teach them that a direct question can clarify and go a long way. So really, even just making them aware, perhaps the first thing is awareness. A lot of people aren't really aware that the power that this has, and it's hard to change. So I would say a big, sort of day where you do some observations and ask your daughters or son to write down how many girls asked questions, how many boys asked the question. How did the teacher answer? How does the girls even raise their hands? I know that in our NBA, as my colleague Jerome was mentioning, we have 95% international students. And a lot of the women have a hard time in getting noticed in class. A lot of the women from India, for example, choose to raise their hands in a very polite manner. Because for them, it's rude to raise your hand up too high because you're blocking your colleague behind you. As a result, they don't get picked on as much, and they're given the feedback, you should speak up more in class. So just being aware of using these examples is very powerful. And I'm happy to share some great bibliography. Those of you who have young girls, I really wish, because here's where it starts. There's an excellent book called The Myth of the Nice Girl, which is a fabulous read. Anything by Dr. Deborah Tannen is fantastic. She says she has a great publication called The Power of Talk, Who Gets Heard and Why. And it's all about her research that she kicked off so long ago in the 70s.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, we'll send out all of the resources that Professor D'Amico references in our follow-up email. We'll get all those for you all. I'm getting a lot of questions on this, and this was actually a question that I had as I was watching. So, we talk about the benefits of teaching women to be more direct, but there's also benefits to the way that women communicate, showing the empathy. There's benefits to that style of leadership as well. So how, even though right now in society, the more direct way is more valued, how do we bring these together? And anyway, I don't know if I asked that question in the best way, but would love to hear.
I always get this question. So, all right, first of all, just because a man is direct does not mean he's not empathetic. So I think showing empathy, of course, it's interesting, the correlation that a lot of women give. Direct is not empathetic because that's what we believe. It's interesting. It's not necessarily. Why? Why is a direct sentence not showing that I care and I'm interested? There's nothing in the grammar of that sentence that shows you that. Yet we believe it is. And that's an interesting insight in itself. Now, a woman's style, of course she's going to have a style, but let's take gender out of it for a moment. Let's look at best practice of powerful speakers. One of the best practices of powerful speakers is this, and this is maybe controversial, but I'm going to say it. It doesn't matter how you feel. It matters who your audience is. People listen to us out of self-interest. Done. So it doesn't matter if you're uncomfortable, if it's new for you, if I'm feeling ill, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares and nobody's thinking about it. So when you step into that and realize, who's my audience? Okay, predominantly male. Interesting. They're going to respond to a certain type of question. Women can do that. Why can't we? It's like a skill set. It's like when you go to a different country. Okay, it's like a different cultural sort of twist. Women can do that. It's adding to your skill set. It's not taking away from who you are. That's a very big difference.
I love that. Yeah, because I could see some people questioning, how do I change my style while still feeling authentic? But I like the idea that it's a skill set, not changing who you are.
Right?
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's it's your audience. It's adapting to your audience, as any good practice of speaker is, and that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of these resources that you've kind of been alluding to, what are your top 5 or however many you want to share? If someone wants to learn more about this topic, if someone wants some real strong examples of how to start applying these, becoming stronger presenters, speaking up in the workplace.
Come to ESADE.
Yes. Would love any other resources you want to recommend.
Sure. I think a huge part of this, because it really does imply a process and it takes a lot of patience. I have to say, patience. I would start reading, because everybody's going to come at it in a different way. You're going to have a different need for it. Depends where you are in your career as well. Depends how old you are, and depends on the experience you're going to have to get. So I would say the first line of action is to read about it. The second line of action is starting to read more, not only about the gender issues of it, but also the neuroscience of leadership. It's fantastic, and it goes for everyone. And if you touch the neuroscience part of it, businesses are a lot like brains. And that will give you, this edge. And you don't even have to be thinking so much about the gender issues and how you feel. It'll be more techniques that are more macro to do with what leaders have to do really when they want to inspire action and move industry and change people, which is so hard anyway, no matter who you are. So I'd say the first line of action is to to read. The second line of action is a good question because we have a very varied audience in very varied places, but I'm sure there are courses. I know that in the States, a fantastic area is the Stanford University has a wonderful neuroscience institute run by Michael Platt. He has a lot of fascinating publications. I don't know if there's sort of like a new Power MBA on neuroscience, which tends to be more compressed courses on a specific topic. That also actually is, you know, another outcome of the stage, which is a fantastic sort of format. That would greatly depend. Here at ESADE, what I'm kicking off actually this fall for our full-time MBAs is a new elective on the gender dynamics of language and leadership, not only for women, but for men. To answer, Tony, the question earlier, this is a question of diversity. So are you aware in the first place? You know, and then how do you manage this? Because in the end, you're promoting diversity, and in the end, you've got to motivate everybody if you want to get things done, especially when those things are hard. And actually, social collaboration also comes in the brain in the form of a very small ancient molecule called oxytocin. And the more oxytocin you can build, the more collaboration and productivity you will have. But that's emotional. So again, it comes from how are you making people feel is the key to everything. Everything else will flow, no matter how hard or challenging it is.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. But I did want to, let me just share my screen one more time here. I did want to thank our presenters once again, Huron and Professor D'Amico. Thank you so much for your unique and informative take on this topic. I think it's a really cool way to think about communication and to look at the brain itself and how it affects everything. So thank you once again. And thank you to our participants. We hope you enjoyed the webinar today. And thank you in advance for completing the evaluation that you'll receive shortly. So we look forward to having you all again for future webinars. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Best of luck, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you again.